My name's Bill Beesman, and I'm never quite sure whether I'm chairman of the Board of Trustees or the president of the Board of Trustees. But it's really incidental. It doesn't make too much difference. I'm supposed to be the boss, but the real boss is sitting down here, Dr. Frank Bird. I'm sorry that I was unable to be here for the first 3 meetings that we held. Unfortunately, I was out of town each time, up in New York, or up in Boston, or somewhere. And I can't make them all, but I've always looked forward to being here, and I truly miss them. This evening, we are very fortunate to have a speaker who has made a study of the Mideast, an area of the world that is playing a major role on the foreign policy decisions of our government and governments throughout the world. There's articles pertaining to the Mideast every day in the news media. I don't know of any area of the world that has the prominence in our everyday thinking, our governments, and our news media. I hope you will excuse me if I inject a personal note at this time. The last meeting we had here was on October 6th, Central Sarbanes. It was a date that President Sadat was assassinated. I had left here by 6:40 that morning going up to New York, and I hopped out of Pennsylvania, grabbed a cab over to the Grand Central Station, heard someone mention that someone had been shot, and I wasn't paying too much attention. I got out, walked to the train station, stopped at the newsstand, did anything in the newspaper. I heard the newsman behind the counter say to the customer, "I wonder if the Times will have a special edition today because of the shooting." And I asked who was shot. He said, "My heavens, haven't you heard that President Sadat has been shot and apparently has been killed?" And as I turned away from the counter to go up to the Pan Am building, I found myself back in an Israeli Air Force base in Sinai, where I'd been in April this year. And several of the people who were with me at that time are here this evening. We're in the headquarters building, and they were speaking to us, the commander of the Air Force Base, an attractive Israeli officer. And one of us asked a question. What does he, as a military person, think of the Camp David Accord, which would give back a major portion, if not all, the remaining portion of Sinai had not been given back? And I recall his answer. I was going up the escalator. He said, from a military point of view, he said, that agreement was indefensible. From a military point of view, we should not give anything back. But he said, from a political point of view, the point of view of peace, and because of Sadat, I'm wholeheartedly in accord with what has been done. But we have very serious concern about Sadat, a very honorable man. He's immortal. He has grave enemies both in and outside of his country, and his health is not that good. And our concern is that Sadat will not be around for long. What will happen when Sadat is no longer in power? Chaos. And this was on my mind as I went up the elevator. What will happen in the Mideast now? I'm confident our speaker will touch upon some of the unrest brought about this assassination, and also the other factors that have a major influence on the actions in the Middle East. It's a great deal of pleasure that I introduce to you Dr. Michael Hudson. He doesn't like the doctorate part, but I like to use that. It kind of carries influence with it what us ordinary mortals do not carry. And therefore I shall introduce him as Dr. Hudson. Hereafter I'll just refer to as Mr. Married, young, much younger than I. Anybody less than 62 years of age is young now. Dr. Hudson is a professor of international relations, School of Foreign Service, Georgetown University, also director of the Georgetown University Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. His undergraduate degree from Swarthmore, he graduated with honors, has his master's and his doctorate from Yale, and I didn't have an opportunity to ask Dr. Hudson what a certificate in Arabic meant that he obtained from Princeton while he was doing his graduate work at Yale. Well, he does have a certificate in Arabic. I imagine he speaks it. He has one, in addition to his other jobs that he had held, other than Georgetown and the academic world, he does have one connection with Baltimore. He spent some time at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies as a professor. Written several articles, many articles and books pertaining to the Mideast. Been a frequent visitor to Lebanon, Israel, and Iraq, Iran, and Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. Consultant on Middle Eastern affairs. Now, I think I've probably said enough. Mr. Hudson, I welcome you to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Beesman and Dr. Bird, that is an introduction that I don't know quite how to respond to, except to say the obvious, that it is exaggerated, and to wish that I were a doctor of the body politic of the Middle East. I'm not. I'm just a doctor of philosophy, a doctor of political science. But I think what the region that we are to look at tonight, the region that, as you indicated, we are constantly concerned with, really needs, is a doctor of some kind, or some kind of medication. Because I think it's fair to say that the body politic of the Arab world is not well. There's some kind of malady, there's some kind of sickness, evident enough, almost wherever you look, on the domestic scene and the regional scene in the Arab world today, a malady that unfortunately can be catching. It's contagious, and it has epidemiological implications for the rest of us. There was a time, and it wasn't all that long ago, when the Middle East was a place where only travelers, they were usually eccentric British travelers, would go and camp out, live with the Bedouin, write fascinating books, and fine, that would be sufficient. And the Middle East supplied a certain kind of outlet or interest for Victorian England and increasingly for the United States, for the young United States. And in those days, it was just travelers, or in our case, missionaries, and we all know about the American missionaries that went out to the Middle East in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. It was really those travelers, missionaries, businessmen, merchants, no doubt many of them from Baltimore, who traveled to the Levant and traded, and so forth. Once in a while, there would be a military encounter. The Barbary Wars, of course, our first serious naval engagement far from our shores, we think of, to the shores of Tripoli, where we may be going again before too long. But those were the days when the Middle East was far off. The United States was a small, marginal power, and if the affairs of the Middle East were to be the responsibility of anybody, they were to be the responsibility of the powers of Europe, the big powers, the superpowers of the day, the British and the French in particular. But those days are long gone. And certainly, since the period of the First World War, which roughly speaking marks the watershed between our relative disengagement and our increasing engagement with the Middle East, we have found that much as we might like to, we cannot ignore this region. Moreover, the region itself appears to be going through an unending series of convulsions, each one of which seems increasingly to threaten the economic or the strategic or the political well-being of this country. World War I think, ushered in two developments that linked us inexorably with the Middle East. One, of course, was the beginnings of the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. And the United States was interested in the Balfour Declaration, the British Balfour Declaration of 1917, rather early on. And as early as 1922, a joint congressional resolution declares that the United States endorses the Balfour Declaration, the idea of establishing a homeland for the Jews in Palestine. And the other thing, of course, is oil. Oil which begins in the 20s, but really in the 30s, to become an increasingly important consideration. For American business, oil companies, a little bit slow to pick up on it, because after all, the United States is the big oil exporter and oil producer in those times. But gradually, the oil companies come to realize that there is oil in Mesopotamia and Iraq. And by the 30s, when the great finds are made in Dammam in Saudi Arabia, the United States finds not only commercial reasons, but increasingly strategic and military reasons. World War II is coming on for developing a certain kind of interest in the region. And of course, these twin concerns, the State of Israel and oil and all that it implies for our strategic national interests, remain extremely vital. To those two has been added a third since the end of the Second World War. That, of course, is the rivalry between the two superpowers. And, of course, from Washington's perspective, that is seen more particularly as the threat or the competition of the Soviet Union for dominance throughout this area. It's convenient, therefore, I think, just at the outset, before we doctors try to diagnose this sick patient, to remember what kind of an interest we have in it. And basically, it is this tripartite interest. We're interested in the Zionist enterprise in Palestine, we're interested in oil, and we are interested in keeping the Soviets out. The question that has bedeviled American foreign policy makers since the late 40s is whether you can do all those things at the same time, or whether they are not, in some sense, irreconcilable with one another. Well, having stated our general interests, let me leap forward to the unhappy events of the last 2 weeks. And what I propose to do in such time as is available to me, which is about a half hour, I would like to ask us to focus on the assassination of Mohammed Anwar Sadat and ask ourselves what it means. What it means for Egypt, what it means for the region, and what it means for the rest of us. And I think if we proceed in this manner, we may be able to address what is, after all, the title of this talk, Internal Tensions in the Arab East and Implications for U.S. Policy. And I'd like to take off, I think, from the events in Egypt and range, time permitting, rather widely around the region to suggest to you what I think some of the effects are and what I think some of the internal dynamics are that make the body politic of the Arab world today ill. Your chairman has described a reaction that I suppose was typical and widespread to the news of the Sadat assassination. I won't add similar memories, and I won't deliver any eulogies either. What I'd like to do is look, and you'll pardon me if it seems rather good, but that's the way I think we must look at these things. I want to take a rather cold-blooded look at how it happened and what it means. I think the assassination of Anwar Sadat in the first place should not have come as a surprise. It's not, I think, really being facetious to say that this sort of thing is an occupational hazard for Middle Eastern rulers. The Arab world, as part of the third world, the developing world in general, has been endemically unstable politically. I've tried to argue in my books and elsewhere that the problem, the object of Middle Eastern rulers, of Arab rulers in particular, and I won't really refer to Israel as we go along because it is different in so many ways, not in every way, but in so many ways. I'll confine my remarks really to the Arab Middle East. That the object or the search that regime leaders must undertake is for some kind of legitimacy. Why is it hard? Why is legitimacy a scarce political resource in the Arab world? Part of the reason is that, in general, the states that emerged are new states, new in the modern sense, at any rate. We all know that Egypt is an old civilization, but one could argue that as a state, Egypt is relatively new. Certainly the states of the Fertile Crescent are quite new creations in every way. New states require new identities. New identities are not easily built up. The idea of civic pride, of civic loyalty, of a civic culture to people whose last and most lasting experience with political rule was at the hands of, as it was for so many hundreds of years, a religiously legitimated sultanate empire, the Ottoman Turkish Empire, with the Sultan Caliph ruling from distant Constantinople. And that wasn't so long ago. People in the Middle East have longer memories than we do, and to them it doesn't seem so long ago. So it's a question of the rulers that emerged in the states that were created after World War I and that achieved some substantial independence in general after World War II. It's a question of fostering new loyalties, creating new cohesiveness, and so forth. Not an easy matter. Secondly, there are no institutions in place for channeling or articulating popular opinion. And so leaders find themselves, in a way, operating in a vacuum. Political scientists of the Middle East will, I think, probably unanimously point to a great weakness, a great structural weakness in the states of the Middle East, which is the lack of linkages between the rulers and the ruled. It's a hard thing for one can be very cynical, and one often is, too cynical perhaps, about Middle Eastern rulers. They're corrupt, they're uneducated, they're capricious, they're avaricious, and so on. But one must try to put oneself in their shoes and realize what a difficult problem it is actually to govern in a region as turbulent and, in a sense, unformed as this is. Complicating the struggle for developing linkages is the question of what kind, what brand, what type of linkages do you in fact create? The impact of the West is an important point here. And since the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt at the end of the 18th century, the Middle East has been subjected to a cultural, intellectual, philosophic invasion, as it were, by Western ideas, norms, rationality, secularism, technology, and in the political field, liberalism, democracy, parliamentarianism, and so on. Fine. But it's not easy. And we know it's not easy because of the many failed experiments in this realm. We know it is not easy to establish parliaments, elections, rational political processes, loyal oppositions. It's hard to do that. And part of the reason it's hard is that there is, quite understandably, a reaction among many Arabs, many Muslim Arabs in particular, against what they take to be foreign, imported, external, alien, wrong forms of government or participation. The failure of parliamentary liberal democracy in the 30s and 40s and 50s in various parts of the Arab world only confirms in the minds of many Muslim Arabs that this is not the way to go. These are not the right linkages to make. But then what kind of linkages do you make? And here we see, if we look only at Egypt, for example, time after time, efforts, whether it's on the part of the king, Fuad or Farouk, the one that was deposed finally in 1952, to have, under British tutelage, of course, a limited form of liberal parliamentary democracy. We find that works for a while, but fails. Then we find, after the Egyptian Revolution, which is a nationalist revolution, objecting to corruption, objecting to the British presence, reacting to Egypt's defeat in the Palestine War of 1948, we find the free officers who come to power, after they've been in power for a while, the same problem of linkages comes up. And they say, well, what shall we do? We dare not have political parties because we know they're corrupt. They were corrupt. So we'll make a party of our own. And this is a homegrown indigenous solution. And so we find in Nasser's Egypt 3 different attempts to build a meaningful single-party apparatus to articulate and express popular opinion, to link in some kind of acceptable way the masses with the regime, to allow for sufficient tutelage, which the officers felt they had an obligation to impart to Egypt, to coexist with some kind of feedback from the masses. The National Union, the Liberation Rally, the Arab Socialist Union, these were all experiments, and they all really failed in this aim. And then we find, again, looking at Egypt, but we could find analogous cases if we were to look at Syria or Iraq or Jordan or a number of other states. We find finally, after Nasser dies in 1970, Sadat comes in. He has to try a little product differentiation to distinguish himself from his gigantic predecessor. And Nasser was a gigantic figure in Egypt and the Arab world. And he says, okay, we're going to open things up. And this is what Sadat attempted to do in the mid-70s. Restoration of the liberal system, dismantling of the single-party apparatus, allowing what he called forums, groupings of political individuals to express themselves. Finally, allowing parties themselves in some full-fledged sense to participate in a new national assembly. And then it turns out that democracy is a troubling thing. And here is Anwar Sadat trying to grapple, ultimately unsuccessfully, but trying to grapple with the great issues of Egypt, economic stagnation and development, the problem of leadership in the Arab world, the problem of Israel and the occupied territories, and so forth. He has ideas, bold ideas, for trying to deal with these matters. But how to have these linkages and still pursue your bold ideas? The 1973 war gives Sadat a tremendous injection of legitimacy. He fights. He doesn't lose. He scores diplomatic victories. He becomes an international figure, and the legitimacy that he generates on the international stage does trickle down, as it were, and improve his reputation among Egyptians. But there are people who object. And we find that in the case of Sadat, a man who's going against very deeply ingrained values and currents, deep hostility to collaboration or acceptance of Israel without certain major concessions by the Israelis in advance, an extremely close relationship with a major Western power, coming after a long history of Egyptian struggles to distance themselves from another major Western power the British, we find people objecting. And then we find that in the economic realm, Sadat, as you recall, attempts to reverse Nasser's economic development strategy, which was a strategy of developing the public sector and encouraging a kind of state capitalism, discouraging foreign investment and so forth. Sadat reverses his field and decides that in the light of Egypt's very precarious financial and economic condition, he must have an opening, an infatah, as he called it, to the outside world, to plug Egypt in to the international system, to encourage foreign investment, to encourage foreign aid, to help Egypt restore its sagging infrastructure, to build a private sector that will be productive, to encourage investment that will not simply go into real estate or to favor a small class. He wants to do this. Doesn't succeed terribly well, but he wants to do this. But my point is, he finds people objecting. What is this opening? What is this embrace of the outside world, of foreign powers, of foreign cultures? Excuse me. And here we find the tragedy, the failure of some kind of institutional structure is the thing that ultimately brings Sadat down. He does not have the linkages, he does not have the persuasive power really to bring Egypt around sufficiently. He finds, therefore, as the pressures get greater from the Muslim Brotherhood, they don't like foreign culture, they don't like the new luxury, the new laxity they see in Cairo, they don't like the casinos on the road to the pyramids, etc., etc. They don't like the Western lifestyles, the movies that are being shown, etc., etc. They don't like dealing with Israel, making a treaty with Israel, still occupying the holy site of the mosques of Jerusalem, still occupying wrongfully, in their view, Palestinian land. They don't like it. And there are a lot of other people that don't like it either. In a situation like that, nothing succeeds like success. And I think as we ruminate over the Sadat assassination, we have to ask ourselves, who is responsible for this event? Just 4 or 8 or 10 or 100 or 1,500 fanatical military men? In a direct sense, perhaps so. But given the precarious nature of rule, of the effort to rule in a country like Egypt or any other country in the Arab world, it's incumbent, it is necessary for the leader. He doesn't have much else. He's got to have something to deliver. He's got to be able to take something home. He's got to be able to say, okay, there's more prosperity for you. Not just you, the agent, or the agent for General Motors, or the person who's got a big contract, or the person who is siphoning off a lot of American aid funds, or the person who is profiting from private petrodollar Saudi investment, but the ordinary person, the worker, the peasant. He has to be able to deliver. It wasn't easy. In fact, he couldn't really do this. And if we were to look at Egypt, not the Egypt of the people who directly profited and conspicuously profited from what was undoubted economic growth in Egypt during the middle and late 70s, if we look beyond those people, we find inflation. We find shortages of commodities. We find a desperate shortage of housing. We find the collapse of infrastructure. We find panicky attempts by the government, motivated by that great engine of revolutionary change in the Third World, the International Monetary Fund, to cut subsidies on basic commodities. Not easy. And so we find that it's hard for Sadat to deliver something to everybody on the domestic scene. And then, more particularly on the foreign scene, and here's where I ask us, who is responsible for what happened? What did Sadat get from Camp David? I think that we have to look to ourselves a little bit and ask, when Sadat made the gamble on Camp David, and I have it on good authority that he didn't want to do it. He wasn't happy with the deal that they struck at Camp David on the Palestinians. He said, this isn't going to work. It's not going to be enough. And Jimmy Carter on the last day said to him, I know it's not enough. Begin is a very difficult man. This is an historic occasion. I've got to take something back down from Camp David with me to Washington. Do me a favor, and I promise you that we will remember this, and we will help you. And we'll help you see that the vagueness of the Palestinian terms on Camp David takes on some kind of positive concreteness for you, so that you can go back to Egypt, and you can go back to the Arab world. You can maintain Egypt's historic position of prominence, if not dominance, in the Arab world. You can go back and hold your head high and say, I really did start the ball rolling on the Palestinian question, and this is what I got. But he didn't get anything. At least he couldn't convince key opinion makers in Egypt, and certainly not in the rest of the Arab world, that he had really gotten anything. And I think that we have a certain degree of responsibility for having encouraged Sadat to get out on this limb, and then, in effect, by not really trying quite hard enough under the Carter administration, and certainly under the new Reagan administration, not trying really hard enough to bring that thing around, so that Sadat, who took all these risks, could go back to his people and say, you didn't believe I could do it, but I did it. And we've got a genuine autonomy process really moving. He couldn't say that. And in fact, quite the contrary. What was happening to Sadat in the last months of his life? He goes and has a meeting with Begin. They kiss and embrace. And the next day, the Israeli planes bomb the nuclear reactor in Iraq. Well, what does one conclude? Sadat looks like a fool. Sadat follows his policy, indeed a Christian policy, if I may say so, of turning the other cheek. And what happens? Do we find relaxation? Do we find any kind of détente? Do we find any kind of slowing down on settlements? No. We find instead the brutal bombing of civilians in Beirut. Well, one will have different opinions, no doubt, about Israel's needs and defense policies and so forth. All I'm interested in here is to suggest that for Sadat, something like that is a tremendous blow against him. And so I think that given what you have when you look at the political culture and political systems of the Arab world, weak structures, lack of linkages, leaders that inevitably stride across the scene, not really knowing what they can do, not really knowing what they're about, having to rely more than we would like them to on raw coercion and suppression to maintain themselves in power. It's no accident that the Arab world governments are among the most repressive in the world. Their surveillance, their multiple intelligence organizations, the mukhabarat, as they're called, the information gathering agencies. It's not surprising that Arab leaders, they can be kings, they can be presidents, whatever, they all seem to have to rely to an unusual extent on coercion. They're afraid. And we know that they have good reason to be afraid. Because we don't find these structures. And in the absence of these structures, and given a turbulent polity, a polity that is undergoing modernization and social development in a whole range of areas, psychological, social, physical, occupational, etc., society in change. Given this, the leader has to come home with something once in a while. I would say, in fact, rather regularly. The leader has to come back with a victory, like the crossing in 73, with a big aid agreement, as Sadat did get. I'm not suggesting Sadat got nothing from Camp David. With Sinai in pieces, these are important things. But I am suggesting that he didn't really get everything he could have. And so, in assigning the blame, let us not conveniently simply dump it all on Colonel Gaddafi's narrow shoulders. Colonel Gaddafi is not really capable, I think, of doing all the things that we attribute to him. Let us not say it was just 4 soldiers. And let us not say that it was a bunch of fanatics. Let us look beyond that and suggest that here was somebody you can like or you can dislike what he did. But if you had a stake in him and you wanted him to last, then you have to give him something once in a while. So much for the assassination itself. Let's turn now and ask what it means. Where are we going? And I'd like to suggest, first of all, that in Egypt, the assassination reveals a more sustained and deeply rooted political malady than our media and Sadat's own friends had thought was really there. We looked very closely in hindsight at the reports that we hadn't paid much attention to as they filtered in over the last 8 months. The Soviets seemed to be plotting. Military officers were observed plotting. Islamic organizations, not just the big Muslim Brotherhood, which was more or less tolerated, but militant, smaller organizations, were assassinating people, were causing disturbances, were throwing bombs. These were all signs of something seriously wrong. And then finally, at the end of the summer, when Sadat made his crackdown, this wasn't the first time, incidentally, but suddenly comes to our notice. When he made his crackdown, we found that things were not all that right in Egypt, and that Sadat's popularity, which is so unmistakable in the world at large, nobody has the affection of Walter Cronkite or Barbara Walters more than Sadat has. One would have thought, well, if they think so highly of him, surely everybody else, surely the Egyptians must. And yet maybe they didn't. It's always interesting to, as a political scientist, to observe the funerals of political leaders who have fallen. And in observing the Sadat funeral, I think it was clear enough that there was, the masses were conspicuous by their silence. There was not a great outpouring, nothing like what had happened a decade earlier for Nasser. Clearly, Sadat had been swimming against some very strong tides. And finally, when it came right down to it, even the highly respected Egyptian security services, and they are regarded as the best in the Middle East outside of Israel, could not save him, and indeed seem to have themselves been contaminated in this plot. Now, as we look at Egypt ahead, my guess is that Hosni Mubarak will be able to pull things together. He is having a little more trouble even now than I thought he might, but he does command the state. The state is very powerful in Egypt, and his crackdown, I think, will be ruthless and probably effective for the time being. There's another factor working for Mubarak, and that is the fact that the rest of Sinai, the final slice, is not due to be returned to Egypt until the end of April 1982. And I'm told that among many, although not necessarily all, but among many of the opposition groups in Egypt, there is a tacit understanding not to create too much of a disturbance that would give the Israelis additional pretext for delaying or even trying to get out altogether of returning the final slice. This may therefore give Sadat a degree of a honeymoon period in the next several months up until the end of April. Sorry, Mubarak. And finally, I'm just trying to dredge up as much good news as I can here. And finally, Mubarak has a certain advantage that Sadat certainly did not have, and that is that he has not publicly insulted virtually every other Arab leader. The vocabulary was colorful: dwarfs, madmen, imbeciles, paranoids, whatever. And it was applied rather liberally in all directions. The Saudi royal family received Sadat's scorn. Gaddafi, of course. Arafat, certainly. Hussein, naturally. That made it hard for Sadat to present any kind of an integrated front. It certainly made it hard for Sadat to play the role that the United States thought he would play after Camp David, which was to sort of mold the rest of the Arab world, or at least the moderate Arab world, behind him. Couldn't do that. Mubarak doesn't have that problem, and therefore I think there is the possibility that he will find it easier to explore, perhaps even to mold a kind of a centrist Arab position that may not be so obstinate, may not be so static, and may in fact, probably not directly through the Camp David process, but through something parallel to it, may in fact allow for some kind of movement in the future. Now, I admit that's being a bit optimistic, but I think these are possible, relatively positive repercussions. Mubarak will have a short-term control. He'll be able to get back together, possibly, with the Arab world. We shall see. However, we must look at the bad news. And the bad news surely is that Egypt, despite everything that has happened in the last decade, much of which has been good, for example, the discovery and production and sales of increasing amounts of oil, the reopening of the Suez Canal, the massive remittances that are coming in, all of which have given Egypt a fairly respectable, generally good economic growth rate. Despite all that, we have some of the social conditions that I alluded to earlier. These remain. And the fact that the American aid mission is so large, the fact that it is almost impossible to spend all the money that the United States is pouring in, leading to the inevitable corruption and wastage and so forth, these are going to continue to be problems for Mubarak's government. Worse than that, though, the assassination, and I think this is the main point, really, the assassination of Sadat carries tremendous symbolic reverberations in Egypt and around the region. And I would be willing to bet that in the back rooms of Cairo and all across the Arab world, where politicians maneuver and plotters plot and ideologues sit and discuss and intellectuals plan futures and officers get together and think ambitiously about what the future should be, the Sadat assassination gives these people a tremendous shot in the arm. It's a real boost for the flagging revolutionary impulse in the region. We've heard a lot about the end of Pan-Arabism and the failure of the revolutions of the 50s and the 60s, and so on. Don't count them out too soon. Sadat had set him up as such a target. He was so prominent. He flaunted these heretical associations. He gloried in his totally deviant behavior, deviant from the prevailing norms of what is right and proper in the Arab world, that he became a tremendous symbol. And the disappearance of the symbol, particularly in the way that it happened, I think is going to revive and give great strength to extremist movements on both sides of the ideological spectrum, in Egypt and elsewhere. I think certainly among the Muslim nationalist fundamentalists, the people that appear to have actually committed the act the events will be seen as an historic milestone. And I should think that it will be extremely difficult for the Mubarak regime really to extirpate or to crush the kind of Muslim opposition that he has. And inasmuch as he comes to power without charisma, without these accomplishments that Sadat and certainly Nasser had built up, Mubarak may find himself under certain pressures to at least bend or at least give a nod in the direction of a more militant policy himself. It's quite possible that we will see him at the proper time, presumably after Sinai has come back. We'll see him backing off a little bit. We'll see him taking a more patriotic, all-Arab stand. We will see him certainly cracking down on religious extremists, but making a point, as Sadat himself often tried to do, of his own personal religiosity. These are all possibilities, I think, that Mubarak may have to explore as he confronts what I think is now a structural and disloyal or subversive opposition on the Islamic right. Two Egyptian sociologists have written some